I want to talk about how the EU Recovery Fund of €750 billion will not be enough. We are in February 2021, and it's needless to say that the hopes are high for this year. The vaccines are arriving, but it doesn't hide the fact that especially the first 2 quarters of 2021 will be a slow crawl towards the light. In fact, the entire year might be a slow crawl towards the light. Now, as an economic response to the corona pandemic, the EU Commission has obligated all member countries to chip in for a recovery fund of €750 billion. The overall purpose of the recovery fund can be divided into 4 areas. Area number 1 is to create growth. Area number 2 is to create jobs. Area number 3 is to spur on green change. And area number 4 is to increase digitization. By critics, this can be seen as either a form of bribe to certain member countries that are questioning their membership of the EU. It can be seen as a direct money injection into struggling member countries with high debt, or it can be seen as a sincere help from rich member countries to struggling fellow members. No matter what, it'll be a direct economic stimulus of the European economy. The EU Recovery Fund was originally thought to be free money, a grant to struggling member countries with no strings attached. However, a coalition of member countries, Holland, Sweden, Austria, and Denmark, insisted that at least a part of the fund be given as loans instead of free money. As a result, €390 billion is to be free money. The rest, €360 billion, is to be accessed as a loan, which the EU member countries can take on if they choose to do so. 70% of the fund's capital is to be distributed through 2021 to 2022. The last 30% will be handed out before the end of 2023. Every member country takes on a burden of extra debt. The winning argument is the advantage of very low interest rates. According to Startup Europe, most of the funds will go to Southern Europe, which is Greece, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, to prevent a potential recession of EU historic proportions. The national governments will be managing and distributing the funds to the worthy recipients. Greece will primarily need funds for the small entrepreneurs who need capital in their early stages of development. Italy, in turn, is plagued by slow digitization and the inability to grow small businesses. Italy is seeking to digitize its infrastructure, and Spain needs to educate its population in digital skills. But, as stated earlier, at this point, €750 billion isn't going to be enough. First, there's the public debt. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the national debt measured in euro was already substantial in several major EU countries. Looking at the government debt to GDP ratios puts many major EU member countries in the red. These are the United Kingdom, Belgium, France, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece. It is pretty safe to assume that the IMF debt prognosis for these countries will not hold. Debt will rise in 2021 in every part of the EU. This creates another problem. Studies have proven that there are limits to how high government debt can be before it begins to increasingly inhibit economic growth. The debt to GDP percentage is an indicator of a nation's ability to repay its debt. Yet how much debt can a nation take on before it starts to hurt its outlook on growth? Depending on which institution you ask, the maximum debt to GDP ratio vary for developed nations and developing nations. According to the World Bank, the maximum debt to GDP ratio for developed countries is 64%. The maximum debt to GDP ratio for developing countries is 40%. The World Bank furthermore warns that countries with prolonged periods of debt to GDP ratios above 77% will experience significantly lower growth. In all cases, it goes that the higher the debt percentage to GDP, the harder it will be to pay off the debt. If the debt to GDP ratio exceeds 90%, it inhibits growth notably for both developed countries and developing countries. Secondly, there's the private debt. Private businesses are hemorrhaging liquidity and cash flow during the pandemic lockdowns. Many have taken on corporate debt due to the low interest rates. If the private debt becomes too great, it risks turning into public debt through defaulting loans under state guarantees and central banks buying up bad debt in the form of corporate bonds. The global debt levels are rising drastically, including the European debt levels. This is, of course, an extension of the COVID-19 pandemic, but the pandemic did not cause this. It just magnified an economic problem within the EU, which has been there for a long time. The economic crisis of the pandemic is far from over. It'll take years to get society back to its pre-pandemic levels. The primary beneficiary of this EU recovery fund is Southern Europe, which is again Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Greece. The EU might likely urge its rich member nations to chip in even more money in another round of quantitative easing in the future. The big problem with free money is that it sounds good, it looks good, and it feels good, but it never teaches people or governments to be responsible with money. Where the monetary policies of John Maynard Keynes have lost their power, governments and central banks are now looking closer at the ideas of former IMF chief Olivier Blanchard, who argues that governments can go into more debt than what has previously been advocated. The EU will most likely be a big advocate for further economic stimulus in 2021 and onward. Despite vaccines being distributed worldwide for the next many months, and the promise of economic recovery hangs as a big carrot in front of us all, the overall mindset in economic circles seems to be the more debt, the better. And that part of the EU recovery fund, which the four member countries fought to turn into a loan, it will never be paid back anyway. The loan will be granted under very generous terms, which is low interest rates, that will not counter inflation rates. The future increasing struggle of sustaining the European Union under higher and higher levels of debt will dwarf the issue of repaying any type of loans. With this kind of mindset, we risk seeing Japanification, national debt levels rising indefinitely, which could potentially become the new normal for EU nations. Such a situation would make any further economic act of solidarity from other member countries utterly meaningless. I hope you liked this video. Consider becoming a subscriber and clicking the like button, and I hope I see you in the next video.